Hi, I'm Philipp Schweighauser, Associate Professor of North American and General Literature at the University of Basel in Switzerland, and I have the pleasure of talking to Russ Castronovo, the Jean Wall Bennett Professor of English and American Studies at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. Now, Russ will give a talk at an upcoming conference. The title of the conference is The Return of the Aesthetic in American Studies, and it happens at the University of Frankfurt, November 29th to December 1st. And the title of his talk there will be Gothic Communications, Terror and the Informational Sublime. Russ has been very kind in giving me a sneak peek of his talk, so that's what allows us to have a conversation about it. So enough by way of introduction. Good to have you, Russ.
Oh, so it's great to be here. And, I should say that, for people who are watching this, they don't know that you and I had a number of communication problems trying to set up this split screen call. But in many ways, that's very apt to what, you and I are both interested in terms of sound, deception, communication. All these things are kind of in the technical background of what brings us together today.
Exactly. So it's really fitting. Form follows content.
Right.
Or the other way around. Now, in your talk, you develop an extremely interesting Gothic theory of communication, which I guess you partly get out of a reading of Charles Brockden Brown's 1798 novel, the Gothic novel, and partly also apply to that novel. Can you tell me and us, the listeners and viewers, a little bit about what got you interested in this specific novel and this question of communication?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And, I'm sure, for people who've taught Charles Brockden Brown's Wieland, it's a notoriously difficult novel, not just to figure out what happens. When I teach this text, I often say to my students, can we just go through the plot and try to describe some of the major events, who's talking to whom, how do people find out information? And as we do so, just trying to figure out at the level of plot what's transpiring, we keep getting hung up on all the distractions, miscommunications, audible deceptions, something that you've written about in the novel. And so what I, in trying to just figure out the very basics of the novel, what I came to think about was that this is a novel about communication itself. And it's a novel that, would suggest there's a Gothic component to communication, because always underneath sort of the visible content is a communication difficulty, an impasse, an imprecision, a distortion. And so what I thought that Brown was doing here is making distortion, to go back to a phrase that you just used a little bit earlier, distortion is sort of both the form and the content of the novel.
No, I mean, I totally agree with you, reading. I think it's a really strong reading. What I find especially fascinating is how it opposes your own Gothic theory of communication to Claude Shannon's mathematical theory of communication, which he developed in the 1948 paper, A Mathematical Theory of Communication. Now,
right.
Shannon was working for Bell Telephone Laboratories back then, so he's an engineer, and this had an enormous impact on a variety of fields, including weapons development. But it's also had an impact on literary and cultural theory. A number of theorists like Jacques Attali, Michel Serres, the German media theorist Friedrich Kittler, the literary scholar William Paulson, the US-American scholar in romance, an expert on romance literature. They've all sort of used that and actually found something good about noise in a way in Shannon, because Shannon paradoxically sees noise as the most information-rich signal, because he thinks that, he doesn't just think, he makes the strong argument, I think, that those signals that are least predictable are also those signals that remove most uncertainty on the part of the person that receives the signal. So on one end of the spectrum, you have redundancy, completely intelligible information, completely predictable also, and thus useless, or at least devoid of true information, whereas noise is at the opposite end of the spectrum, and is super full of information, but unintelligible. And so, Shannon quickly sort of dismisses noise as, it's unintelligible, it's useless. But, like other theorists have sort of seen this idea, this original idea that noise is the most information-rich signal. I've sort of picked up on that and developed understanding of noise that sees it actually as a potentially beneficial component of communication, something that disrupts conventional, habitualized forms of communication, something that is maybe in alliance with, what Viktor Shklovsky calls estrangement, or Theodor Adorno calls negativity. So your conceptualization of noise seems to be a different one, if I get you right.
Well, it's you give a really good account right now of what's going on in Shannon. And, it's also something that you developed, and I'm indebted to, in your book, The Noises of American Literature, which opens with a really important discussion of Shannon. And then he has this collaborator, as you know, named Weaver, who comes along and helps popularize Shannon's theory. And you're right that everything we do today, is this call would not be possible without Claude Shannon's work at Bell Labs and the mathematical theory of communication. And so one of the things that interests me is not only the content of what Shannon is writing, but also the context. So if I could talk about that for a second. So you kind of talk about, it's important to remember that Shannon, before he gets to the mathematical theory of communication, is working on secrecy. Right. And he's working on guided missile systems. And he's also at the end of his career, he'll be, working with the NSA. And so that's one of the things that interests me is secrecy and surveillance. Not incidentally, one of his favorite stories is Poe's The Gold Bug, which is all about cryptography. And the way that I was reading a biography of Shannon, and the way that he demonstrated all the what you're talking about in terms of content, messaging, about uncertainty, and about the need to communicate where you have a certain amount of freedom, which is related to entropy. Because if you already know the message that's being sent, then there's no information that is being conveyed. Right? Is what Shannon will say. And the way that he did this was, he picked up. This is the way he supposedly demonstrated. The story goes. He picks up a book from the shelf, and he starts reading it letter by letter to his wife. So like he'll say, well, the first letter is T, and then he asks his wife, what do you think the next letter will be? And then she has to guess. And he says is something like, the sentence that he parses out is something like the lamp was on the edge of and then he says the letter D, and his wife is able to fill in the rest of the message and say the lamp was on the edge of the desk. Now, why this is important to me is that he's reading from a Raymond Chandler detective novel. and so I think that's not uncoincidental about what is going on with Brown and information and noise, because the Gothic is also the precursor to the detective novel. And what one is trying to do there is find information, trying to sort through all the noise so you can find the killer or the culprit. And what Shannon, I think, is you're right to say this, that he's not interested in the noise. He's only interested in who may have been, let's say, to go back to my Raymond Chandler detective novel, he's only interested in who is the criminal, identifying that criminal out of the range of all the false suspects. But what I think Brown tells us, and what I think the Gothic tells us, it's actually is that we're all guilty, right? That we're all participating in this noise, and that the noise that Shannon sort of wants to bracket has some of the most relevant information, not only about crime, but about communication itself.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with your assessment of sort of Shannon's own attitude toward noise. I mean, he's an engineer. He's interested in the communication of self-identical information. He's interested in, what's being sent, arriving the way it was sent.
And just so, if I could,
I totally agree. It's really like literary and cultural theorists and media theorists who've sort of, picked up on this one aspect of his work, you know, this idea that noise is information-rich signal, to give a more positive twist on that. And also, I mean, and we both look at Weaver's addition to that, and he talks about, you know, well, Shannon is not interested in meaning per se, right?
Yeah, which is such, I just gotta say, that's such a startling statement when you read that. Like, it's like comes on page 4 or something of this. He says, "I am not interested at all in meaning." And as literary scholars, you know, that's in many ways what we're interested in. He means semantic content, I think, is the word he uses, right? He wants to bracket semantic content. But, you know, I think this is the place that we're both, I think, interested in, not just in bringing semantic content back, but also showing how the purely formal system of communication, right, is itself a type of semantic content.
Exactly. And so the thing about Shannon and Weaver is, you know, you and I just suspect that we have to read Shannon via Weaver.
Right.
Unless you're much better at equations than I am.
No, I am not.
I don't know what Alan Sokal would say about us.
Right.
You know, so we rely on Weaver's expository introduction. It's a really extensive introduction to Shannon's work. We rely on him. But like, what's really interesting that he sort of takes the liberty of saying, well, you know, let's involve semantics in this, right? Even though he stresses throughout, Shannon's not interested in semantics, but let's involve semantics. And he actually introduces something he calls semantic noise. And I guess, you know, where the question is like, is this semantic noise? And but we'll leave the technical side to, I don't know how interesting this is to our viewers, but like, where this semantic noise is actually already part of the equation in Weaver's version, or still remains external. I guess we read this a bit differently. But what I find extremely convincing is that, you know, you locate this at the source in Brown's Wieland. You know, you locate, you write that something along the lines of, you know, noise is there from the get-go. Noise is always part of the equation. Noise is already always in the channels of communication, which it, you know, is also from a technical perspective. So I'm completely with you on there. I wonder whether some Gothicism is already in Shannon and Weaver. You know, like some idea that noise is already at the source is actually already there in Shannon and Weaver, or whether one needs to introduce it with developing an exciting new Gothic theory of communication. But that's a quibble, I think, because
no, but I think it's important. I think it's an important point, and that's what I was trying to say. That's why I think that incidental detail about him going to the detective novel is and that for him to understand it, for him to provide an analogy, and then he picks a pulp novel that Raymond Chandler writes. It's called The Pickup on Noon Street, and I think that is indeed indicative of the fact that noise is already imminent to the system itself, right? And I think so. That's a really relevant way that you're suggesting it.
Just think of all the post-structuralist debates that Edgar Allan Poe's The Purloined Letter has created, right?
Right.
That's an early detective novel.
Right. So yeah, and that's really clever that you bring that up, because if post-structuralists like Derrida and Lacan were interested in The Purloined Letter, it was systems engineers were saying, no, you have the wrong text. The right text is the gold bug. Right. And that's why, and to understand communication. So it's great that we're brought back to Poe in all of this.
Yeah. But let's also go into your reading of Brown's Wieland, which, you know, utterly fascinating reading. Where exactly are the sources of noise for you in that text? Where does noise come from, if it's there from the get-go?
Right. For me, it comes from things like ink, paper, the mail, translations, right? I think one of the clearest places in Wieland is, remember when they're in the temple and they're discussing Cicero, and they have this argument about the translation, and is the translation corrupt? And it's also the case that there's this bust of Cicero that's supposed to be fabricated after an original that was found in Modena in the ruins. Though Clara says, well, maybe this isn't quite the case. Maybe it's not founded upon an original. But I think what we see that people are always going back to these source texts, whether it's a letter, a bust, a translation. And when they get to the source, there's some sort of, either there's too much, there's some sort of supplement, or there's some sort of aporia, right? That there's some sort of gap. There's something that's initially, and this is where I think, what makes Brown's plots move. There's something that Gothic about this, right? There's something corrupt and at the core.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because, in a way, noise is located in these texts, and you really stress the reading process. I tend to stress more sort of the perception process.
Yes, right.
The fallibility of perception, which is kind of an old topos, right? Gothic novels explore the limits of Enlightenment rationality, especially the limits of Enlightenment Lockean empiricism, which you also address. One could also think of this as an aesthetic question, because aesthetics is originally the science of sensuous cognition, formulated by a rationalist, Alexander Gottlieb Baumgarten, who had severe doubts about the senses, promoted the senses as an avenue to knowledge, but had severe doubts about it, called them the senses an inferior faculty. So for me, this is also a question of aesthetics, which gets us again back to the topic of the conference. But I think what I find extremely interesting about your article is how it seems to me that the noise is at its source, in the sense that it's already in the texts that are being read. It's already in the sort of overabundance of information that is being communicated within that novel. But it's also, and that's there, I think you introduce a second layer when you draw on systems theory and say that it's also becomes present when the media of communication, or the materiality of communication, we could call it, that are usually invisible become visible. Your example is Clara reflecting on her writing of the letter that we read. Mm-hmm. My example would be Clara drawing a sketch of Carvin and reflecting on, reflecting on perceiving Carvin, creating a mental image, then creating the sketch, and then actually looking at the sketch and interpreting it and wondering about, how reliable it is. So I think that's for me extremely helpful, this doubleness of the noisiness, like it's in the text, but it's also in the media and the materiality of the media themselves.
I appreciate you pointing that out, because there is this, and let's work with the example that you gave about Clara's sketch of Carvin. I mean, it becomes this recursive loop, does it not? And this is where I'm interested in Nicholas Luhmann, and I appreciate the fact that I'm bound to Germany to talk about Luhmann. So I'm actually who's a notoriously slippery thinker. So it will be great to have input from everybody at the conference about Luhmann. But if we go back to, and here's where I'm indebted to you, if we go back to what you were writing about. Baumgarten's idea of aesthetics, right? One of the things that we might begin to wonder is, and this is what Clara might, this is a scene I don't write about, but with the portrait that she does, how much are the cognitive senses themselves caught in that type of recursive feedback loop, which you describe in terms for Clara, right? She looks at the sketch, she produces a sketch, she looks at the sketch, and then she kind of, if I'm correct, she kind of stays up all night pondering it, right? Yeah. And it's this kind of autoerotic type of scene. So what we could think about is that, if Luhmann is talking about autopoetic or autopoietic moments, Brown is kind of shifting us to the autoerotic, which is a different, we might want to think about as an embodied type of recursive feedback loop. I think
it's wonderful. It's a wonderful idea. I mean, you and I were told to keep this to below 10 minutes. We're at 19 minutes.
Oh, okay. Well,
how can you discuss anything in 10 minutes?
I appreciate that. I should say that we can wrap up, but this is the problem with communication, right? This is the problem with information overload. We have so much more to say, and we can't begin to contain it. So yes, indeed.
Again, we perform what we're talking about. It's
Yes.
been really wonderful discussing your work with you. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege.
Thank you,
Russ.
Philip. Very good.